This is the Music Halls of Fame podcast. This week we honor the year in music for 1997 along with a member of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame class of 1997. We also make the case for you to vote for Joy Division and New Order to be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And our Spotlight Museum is the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. Before we get going with the podcast, like everyone tells you, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you'll know when these podcast episodes drop, which is usually every Thursday. Now, on to this week's episode. The year was 1997. In music, the song Candle in the Wind, the Princess Diana edition, was first played by Sir Elton John at Princess Diana's funeral and then released as a single. It became the biggest selling single of all time worldwide. The biggest phenomenon of the year was also related to Great Britain, Spice Girl Mania, as the Spice Girls released their debut album and soon thereafter became pop culture icons. Other artists who burst onto the scene in 1997 included Third Eye Blind, the Backstreet Boys, Daft Punk, Meredith Brooks, Duncan Sheik, Savage Garden, Paula Cole, and Hanson. Bands that were formed in 1997 included the Buckwheat Boys, Coldplay, Death Cab for Cutie, Destiny's Child, Eiffel 65, Gym Class Heroes, Interpol, Lost Prophets, Marcy Playground, Newfound Glory, the New Radicals, the Plain White T's, the Benga Boys, the White Stripes, and the Yin Yang Twins. Bands who either broke up before their inevitable reunions or announced their hiatus included 7 Year Bitch, Accept, Big Audio Dynamite, Bonham, the Cocteau Twins, the Cranes, Dinosaur Jr., Dissolve, EMF, the Fugees, the Gin Blossoms, Gore, My Bloody Valentine, New Riders of the Purple Sage, Obituary, The Power Station, Quad City DJs, Rainbow, the Rembrandts, the Rollins Band, Soundgarden, the Sundays, Throwing Muses, Tony, Ugly Kid Joe, Urge Overkill, and Whitesnake. Bands that reformed in 1997 included Blondie, Depeche Mode, Echo and the Bunnymen, Jane's Addiction, Suicidal Tendencies, and Sunny Day Real Estate. In the meantime, Vince Neil rejoined Motley Crue that year. Artists who were born in 1997 include DJ Alan Walker, rappers Coi Leray and Lil Yachty, along with Rico Nasty, Blueface, Cupcake, Asian Doll, Kodak Black, and singers Jungkook of BTS, Camila Cabello, Becky G, Rebecca Black, Dinah Jane of Fifth Harmony, Her, Roseanne Park, Ruby Rose, Bella Thorne, Park Jimin, Zara Larson, Phineas O'Connell, Jorja Smith, and Youngblood. Artists who passed away in 1997 included the notorious B.I.G., Mr. Wallace himself, who was shot and killed, unfortunately. Also, singers Townes Van Zandt, Michael Hutchence of INXS, John Denver, Jeff Buckley, Fela Kuti, Laura Nyro, Laverne Baker, Nicolette Larson, Ronnie Lane, Jimmy Rogers, Jimmy Witherspoon, Johnny Copeland, Thelma Carpenter, Billy McKenzie of the Associates, Ron Holden, Lawrence Payton of the Four Tops, guitarist Randy California, Luther Allison, and Michael Hedges, Elvis's manager, Colonel Tom Parker, opera singer Charles Craig, conductor George Solti, drummer Tony Williams, and jazz violinist Stefan Grappelli. The Spice Girls' Spice was the biggest selling album of 1997, according to Billboard magazine. Other big albums were by Radiohead, U2, No Doubt, Notorious B.I.G., Puff Daddy, Mace, George Strait, Aerosmith, Scarface, Prodigy, Oasis, and Celine Dion. Aside from Candle in the Wind, other big singles in 1997 were Jules' You Were Meant for Me, Puff Daddy's I'll Be Missing You, and Can't Nobody Hold Me Down, Toni Braxton's Unbreak My Heart, R. Kelly's I Believe I Can Fly, En Vogue's Don't Let Go, Mark Morrison's Return of the Mac, LeAnn Rimes' How Do I Live, and the Spice Girls' Wannabe. In country music, Garth Brooks held a free concert in Central Park in New York City that had over 1 million people show up for it. Shania Twain released her album Come On Over late November of that year. Its full impact would be felt in 1998, and eventually it would become the biggest selling country music album of all time. Other big albums were released by Garth Brooks, George Strait, Tim McGraw, LeAnn Rimes, Clint Black, Martina McBride, Clay Walker, Alison Krauss and Union Station, Tracy Lawrence, and Trisha Yearwood. Tim McGraw and Faith Hill's duet, It's Your Love, became the first song in 20 years to hold the #1 spot in Billboard's country singles chart for more than 5 weeks. Meanwhile, Trisha Yearwood and LeAnn Rimes both had hits with different versions of the same song, How Do I Live, from the Con Air movie soundtrack. Other hit singles were by Lone Star, Mark Chestnut, Diamond Rio, Reba McEntire, Michael Peterson, Toby Keith, Kevin Sharp, Kenny Chesney, Alan Jackson, and Deanne Carter. 1997 was the year of the Notorious B.I.G. and Puff Daddy for all the wrong reasons, as Biggie was killed on March 9th, and then his album Life After Death was released 16 days after his death, which is really creepy foreshadowing when you think about it. That had the hits Hypnotized and Mo Money, Mo Problems. Meanwhile, Puff Daddy and the Family's album No Way Out became a huge hit, with his Biggie tribute song with Faith Evans, I'll Be Missing You, becoming a Grammy-nominated hit, along with singles Can't Nobody Hold Me Down and It's All About the Benjamins. Other big hip-hop albums were put out by the Wu-Tang Clan, KRS-One, Capone and Noriega, Scarface, True, Funkmaster Flex, Missy Elliott, Bone Thugs and Harmony, Coolio, Master P, Gravediggers, Busta Rhymes, EPMD, LL Cool J, Jay-Z, Mystical, along with a posthumous release from Tupac. Other hit songs were released by Mace, Busta Rhymes, Coolio, Da Brat, Scarface, Nas, Master P, Timbaland and Magoo, Warren G, The Roots, and Mac 10. Dance music saw its usual pop and R&B crossover songs by artists such as Michael Jackson, Mariah Carey, the Spice Girls, the Backstreet Boys, and U2 during their electronica phase. As far as more legit quote-unquote EDM artists, there was Barbie Girl from Aqua, White Town's Your Woman, You're Not Alone from Olive, Sash with Stay, Encore Une Fois and Ecuador, Sunshine from Dario G, Ultra Nate's Free, Daft Punk's Around the World and the Funk, Moby's James Bond theme, Red Five's The Beat Goes and I Love You Stop, Apollo 440's Ain't Talking About Dub, Nailin' and Kane's Beach Ball, Funky Green Dog's Fired Up, Rosie Gaines's Closer Than Close, and Something's Going On from Todd Terry with Martha Wash and Jocelyn Brown. The big artists in Latin music for 1997 were Julio Iglesias, Luis Miguel, Enrique Iglesias, Selena, Grupo Limite, Shakira, Los Del Rio, the Gypsy Kings, Los Tremorarios, Marco Antonio Solis, and Jordi. At the Grammy Awards for that year's music, Bob Dylan's Time Out of Mind actually won Album of the Year, while Sean Colvin's Sonny Came Home won Song and Record of the Year. Paula Cole won Best New Artist. LeAnn Rimes won Artist of the Year at the Billboard Music Awards. Babyface, Celine Dion, and the Spice Girls won at the American Music Awards. The music video for Jamiroquai's song, Virtual Insanity, won 4 awards, including Video of the Year at the MTV Video Music Awards. At the Eurovision Singing Contest, which was held that year in Dublin, Ireland, Katrina and the Waves from England won for the song Love Shine a Light. Katrina and the Waves were also one of the better-known Eurovision contestants since Celine Dion in 1988, with the band having already found commercial success in 1985 with the hit song Walking on Sunshine. At the Academy Awards, James Horner won Best Original Score for Titanic, and the love song from Titanic, My Heart Will Go On, won Best Original Song. At the Tony Awards, another Titanic won. The Broadway show Titanic, which had nothing to do with the movie version of Titanic, that won Best Musical, and Chicago won Best Revival of a Musical. Trumpet player Wynton Marsalis became the first jazz artist to win the Pulitzer Prize for Music in 1997. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction ceremony was held on May 6th at the Renaissance Cleveland Hotel in the museum's hometown of Cleveland, Ohio, for the first time, as it had been held in New York City for almost a decade by then. Stephen Stills became the first artist to be inducted twice in the same night, once as a member of Buffalo Springfield and also as a member of Crosby, Stills and Nash. Neil Young, who was also inducted as a member of Buffalo Springfield, protested the event and did not show up. He didn't like the fact that you had to pay $1,500 a plate for a seat, and also because the ceremony was being shown on VH1 that year. Considering that it's now being shown behind a paywall on HBO, VH1 didn't seem like a bad idea when you think about it. However, this is Neil Young, who famously made the song This Note's for You about artists who shill for corporations and products like Coke and Pepsi. Boy, those times have changed. At the ceremony itself, the hall inducted King Records founder Sid Nathan into the non-performers category. Mahalia Jackson and Bill Monroe were inducted into the early influencers category. In the performers category, the hall inducted the aforementioned Buffalo Springfield and Crosby, Stills and Nash, along with Parliament Funkadelic, Joni Mitchell, the Young Rascals, the Jackson 5, and this next group. The brothers Gibb, or the Bee Gees, had two parts to their career. The brothers of Barry, Robin, and Maurice Gibb were born on the Isle of Man in England and then lived in Manchester, England. They started out in a band called the Rattlesnakes in 1955. When the band broke up, they formed a band called Johnny Hayes and the Blue Cats. Johnny Hayes only lasted about 4 months as the Gibb family moved to Queensland, Australia. There, they plied their trade by playing at a racetrack as the entertainment break and also in the resort towns along the coastline. At this point, they found a manager who got them a record deal, and they came up with their name, the Bee Gees. They released about 3 singles a year that didn't do anything except for a minor hit called Wine and Women. After 4 years, the brothers finally scored a major hit with their 12th song called Spicks and Specks. In 1967, they moved to England in search of bigger success. There, they met up with the guy who would become instrumental in all that success, record executive Robert Stigwood. Under Stigwood's hand, the Bee Gees had some big hits like Massachusetts and To Love Somebody. Then, the pressure of fame got to them and they broke up in the late 1960s. That was career number 1. Career number 2 started when they eventually got back together in the mid-1960s and started changing their sound to disco. It was at this point where fate took over and gave them their magnum opus, Saturday Night Fever. Here's some trivia about the movie that turned the Bee Gees into superstars. It was all actually based on fake news. Here's what happened. In 1976, music and then movie producer Robert Stigwood was looking for his next big hit. He had just come off of making 2 successful movie musicals, Jesus Christ Superstar and The Who's Tommy. An article in New York Magazine caught his attention. It was titled The Tribal Rights of the New Saturday Night by Nick Cohen. The article told the story of a guy named Vinny and his buddies who were dancers in a discotheque in Brooklyn and who always dreamed of something bigger. Stigwood was hooked on the story and decided to turn the article into a movie. Vinny became Tony Manero, Stigwood got the Bee Gees, then grabbed an up-and-coming actor from a TV show at the time, and released Saturday Night Fever. Saturday Night Fever became one of the biggest movies of the year. It turned that actor, John Travolta, into an international star, along with getting him an Academy Award nomination for playing Tony. It turned the Bee Gees into one of the biggest musical acts of the century and brought disco out of the minority and gay clubs and made the musical genre mainstream. Soon, every city had disco clubs. Radio stations changed their formats from rock and roll to disco, and even if they didn't, they at least had a top 10 disco list every week just to stay relevant with the times. Now, this story would be good right there, except that it's not the end of the story. See, in 1994, almost 18 years after the original magazine article came out, Nick Cohen fessed up. In an article in the Guardian newspaper, he admitted that he actually made up most of the article. He had just moved to New York City at that point in his life when he was hired to write the article, and he really didn't know the neighborhood in Brooklyn well enough to know any of the guys there. The name of the discotheque in the article, Odyssey 2000, was real, and Vinny and his friends were Italian. But that was all that was real about the article. In fact, Vinny was actually based on a guy Nick knew from his old English neighborhood back in the 1960s. So you see, John Travolta and the Bee Gees owe their superstardom partially to fake news. When the article that inspired the movie Saturday Night Fever premiered in the June 7th, 1976 issue of New York Magazine. Also, a little bonus trivia for you. June 7th also plays heavily in something else concerning John Travolta. On June 7th, 1972, the Broadway musical Grease premiered, and when it turned into a movie, Robert Stigwood was the producer at that point and grabbed the guy he had already made into a star, John Travolta, for the main role. The 1-2 punch of Saturday Night Fever and Grease, along with another movie called Urban Cowboy that was made soon thereafter, made John Travolta into the hottest actor in the world. So, June 7th must be a lucky day for Travolta. Back to the Bee Gees, though. After the success of Saturday Night Fever, the group put out another chart-topping album called Spirits Having Flown. The Bee Gees' other brother, Andy Gibb, became a huge star in his own right with the album Shadow Dancing. Then, tragedy started to strike the family. First, the inevitable backlash against disco happened that crushed many careers. Dance music went back to the underground, got mixed up with some electronic music, and became techno, house music, trance music, and eventually the EDM explosion in the 2010s. The disco backlash completely hurt all of the brothers' careers. Both the band and Andy Gibb went from being the biggest worldwide acts of the late 1970s to being laughingstocks in the early 1980s as people's tastes went into corporate rock and new wave music thanks to MTV. Brothers Maurice and Andy developed drug and alcohol problems. Andy passed away in 1988 from an inflammation of the heart due to a viral infection. Some people said that it was because his heart had been damaged from a cocaine addiction that he had gotten over by then, but had left his heart unable to cope with the viral infection. Regardless, Andy's passing at the age of 30 gutted his brothers. They continued on, however, despite their problems, playing what turned out to be their final concert together in 2002. Then, in 2003, while waiting for surgery to take care of an intestinal issue, Maurice had a heart attack and passed away in 2003 at the age of 53. The remaining brothers made appearances until 2012 when Robin Gibb, who had liver cancer at that point, passed away at age 61 from kidney and liver issues. Since then, Barry has performed periodically with his son, along with his niece and nephew, along with keeping the band's legacy going with album releases and a planned biopic. The Bee Gees have sold over 220 million records and have won 5 Grammy Awards, all for the soundtrack to Saturday Night Fever. The soundtrack is 132 on Rolling Stone's Top 500 Greatest Albums of All Time list. Even after Saturday Night Fever, they kept the disco sound going with their 1979 album, Spirits Having Flown. They have 35 top 100 singles, and during the Saturday Night Fever era, they had 3 of the top 5 songs in the same week on the Billboard Singles Chart. They also wrote and produced chart-topping songs for a number of artists, including Dionne Warwick, Barbra Streisand, and of course the group's brother, Andy Gibb. The group was also put into the Library of Congress National Recording Registry for the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack in 2013. Presented for induction by Brian Wilson of the 1988 Hall of Fame inductees The Beach Boys, and also by Raphael Sadig of the group Tony Tony Tony, Barry, Maurice, and Robin Gibb, the Bee Gees, inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, class of 1997. Before we get to the rest of the podcast, we'd like to tell you about our other podcast, the Music History Today podcast. Every day we tell you what happened on that date in music history, along with music releases, birthdays, and passings. So, if you like this podcast and want more music history, then please search the Music History Today podcast in audio or video form on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast from. This week, we're going to make the case for you to vote for Joy Division and New Order to be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Now, this is a little strange because the Hall combined their nominations and put both bands into one slot. Considering that New Order is Joy Division without their former lead singer, I guess that makes sense. However, Rage Against the Machine lost lead singer Zach De La Rocha for a while, but the rest of the band stayed intact, grabbed new lead singers/rappers, and became Audioslave and Prophets of Rage before going back to being Rage. And only Rage is up for a nomination this year. Considering what New Order has done on their own without being Joy Division, it does make them worthy of having their own nomination, to be honest with you. We'll explain right now. Joy Division's lead singer was Ian Curtis. Ian was born in England on July 15, 1956. As a child, he was very gifted, especially as a poet. Unfortunately, he was also bored in school and constantly got into trouble. He was caught shoplifting records and also stealing prescription pills from elderly people and selling them to his friends. On June 4th, 1976, Ian went to a Sex Pistols show in Manchester, England. That particular show would impact a lot of people who went. In fact, some of the people who went ended up so inspired that they formed their own groups that went on to change music, such as the Smiths. That show was where Ian met Bernard Sumner and Peter Hook. They decided to start a group together, found drummer Stephen Morris for the group, and called it Warsaw Pact, then shortened that to Warsaw, and then just completely changed the name and came up with Joy Division. Joy Division had a very brief run on 2 major label releases. Their music was moody and ushered in the post-punk era of British music. Ian's style was quiet and his dancing was a bit strange, to be nice about it, but people couldn't stop looking at him on stage. What people didn't realize at the time was that Ian was actually suffering from seizures. In fact, he would sometimes have seizures while on stage and would have to be taken off for treatment. Ian was also suffering from depression, which got especially bad in 1980. Add to that a failing marriage, and you had a recipe for implosion. And on May 17, 1980, while going through his divorce, Ian went to visit his soon-to-be ex-wife. After talking with her, he asked her to leave the house for a while. And when his ex came back in the morning of May 18th, 1980, she found Ian in the kitchen. He had committed suicide overnight by hanging himself. He was 23 years old at the time. As far as the legacy goes, Joy Division remains one of the innovators of the post-punk revolution that happened in the 80s. Groups like The Cure and Depeche Mode followed their style and became huge. As far as why Joy Division should be considered for the Hall, well, it's not for their hit singles or albums, honestly. In England, they had 5 singles hit the charts. 3 went top 40 and none of them went top 10. In America, it's actually worse. They had 0 hits. Even the one song that everybody in America knows them for, Love Will Tear Us Apart, was never actually a hit here. It became a cult hit long thereafter. Now, the reason why they should at least be in is because of their influence on the post-punk era. Plus, you gotta figure, if you've influenced both The Cure and Depeche Mode, and they're now both blissfully in the Hall of Fame, thank you, Hall voters, finally, then you should put Joy Division in, who actually influenced both of those groups. One would think. Now, all of that is well and good, but New Order could also be in as their own separate nomination. See, what happened was, after Ian's suicide, rather than break up the band, Bernard Sumner, Peter Hook, and Stephen Morris decided to do something different. First, they grabbed keyboardist Gillian Gilbert, who was Morris's girlfriend at the time. Then they decided to marry post-punk rock with a new sound that was just beginning to bubble up from the underground, electronic music, which was different from the synth pop that had taken over Great Britain at that point. Then they made it danceable. Some people started to call it alternative dance, just for a catchy phrase. The band combined post-punk rock with EDM and anchored what became known as the Manchester music scene, which was a play of words for Manchester, where the group came from, and it developed a now iconic music pedigree. Even if you don't know or love EDM, or you don't know their hits like True Faith or Bizarre Love Triangle, then you definitely know what is officially the biggest selling 12-inch record of all time, Blue Monday. In 1981, they put out their first album, Movement, and then they got to work on their next album, 1983's Power, Corruption, and Lies. The song Blue Monday actually comes from that album. The band wrote it on a step-time sequencer in binary code. The instantly recognizable semi-quaver kick drum intro was actually programmed on an Oberon DMX drum machine. The reason why Gilbert's synthesizer melody sounds a little out of step with the beat on occasions is that she forgot to program a note into the sequencer. But the band liked it so much, so they kept the mistake in. Also, what makes the song distinctive is just when the beat, melody, and groove are established, a series of offbeat hi-hat cymbal crashes with a kick drum interrupt the original beat before the drop kicks in again, even louder and layered with more synths and vocal choir background before Bernard's low-register, slow deadpan vocals start in with "How Does It Feel to Treat Me Like You Do?" The song itself was influenced by a bunch of different songs throughout, sort of an informal sampling, if you will. The synthesizer bass line actually comes from Sylvester's song, You Make Me Feel Mighty Real. The actual bass line is taken from the soundtrack to the movie A Few Dollars More. Parts of the song were also influenced by the Donna Summer song, Our Love. Blue Monday was released as a 12-inch record on March 7, 1983, and became the biggest-selling 12-inch record of all time. During its original edit, it went top 10 in 10 different countries, including number 1 in the UK, and was the biggest single of 1983 in New Zealand. New Order did 2 more versions of the songs in 1988 and 1995, both of which did very well on the charts. It's been covered numerous times, most notably by the band Orb, who turned it into a hit for themselves. Blue Monday also showed up in commercials and TV shows, lately in the Call of Duty Cold War video game commercials. Aside from having a huge influence on EDM DJs, it's also still being used in EDM sets everywhere to this very day. As New Order, they put out 10 studio albums. Of those, only 1993's Republic managed to go top 15, landing at number 11. In England, though, it's a completely different story, with 6 of their albums going to number 1. Singles-wise, they put out 39 of them. New Order did well on the U.S. dance charts with 14 top 10 songs, including 5 that went number 1. In England, 16 of them went to the top spot. Between both bands, the amount of influence that they had on the British music scene and, in turn, on the American music scene, thanks to MTV, that should hopefully get both of bands into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame this time, since they've actually been eligible for the longest time now. And you can help to get them in, finally. Go to rockhall.com to vote. That's rockhall.com. You can vote for 5 different nominees every day until the end of April, and the link for voting is in the show notes. This week's Spotlight Museum is the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. The museum is located on the National Mall, right across the street from the Washington Monument. The museum highlights the experience and contributions of African Americans to specifically America and, more broadly, the world. A lot of the museum deals with slavery and civil rights. There's an actual slave cabin, an airplane that was flown by a member of the Tuskegee Airmen, as well as items pertaining to the military, religion, literature, and politics. The museum also has an extensive collection of artifacts concerning music. The museum boasts Chuck Berry's Pink Cadillac, for instance. Also, stage costumes worn by Parliament Funkadelic and others, along with other recordings, sheet music, photos, and such. There's also a great online resource on their website where they put a lot of their collection online for people to look at. The museum is open daily from 10 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. Admission is free. After all, your tax dollars paid for it. However, the only way that you can walk into the museum without a pass is if you show your military ID. Otherwise, you either have to try to get timed passes in the mornings, especially on the morning that you want to go, which really you need to get there early because those things run out very quickly. There is another way that you can get them. You can get passes in advance online. So, check the museum's website, which is nmaahc.si.edu, for information about the time passes along with COVID admission information, because, you know, those things tend to change on a whim depending on what's going on. We'll put the website's link in the show notes as well. Rosetta Rubin was born on March 20th, 1915 in Cotton Plant, Arkansas, to Katie Bell Newbin. At least that's the official story of her birth. Some researchers also think that her name was actually Rosetha Atkins, and she was born to Katie Harper. Not much is known about her father except that he was a singer. What is definitely known is that Rosetta's mother was a singer who was also heavily involved in the church as a singer and a preacher. She was also a feminist who encouraged women in the congregation to sing, but Rosetta's mother also taught the spiritual word in church, which was relatively unheard of in that era. Rosetta's mother had an impact on her daughter, both in attitude and in her career choice. It was her mother who introduced Rosetta to gospel music and also to the guitar at age 6. Rosetta became very proficient at playing the guitar and was still, at 6 years old, traveling and playing with her mother as part of a traveling ministry show. They toured the South for a few years until they moved to Chicago, Illinois. For the next decade, Rosetta and her mother toured the North, where Rosetta developed a reputation as a child prodigy. She also fell in love with, and at age 19, married a preacher who toured with them. At this point, Rosetta then took her new husband's last name, Thorpe, changed a vowel, and made that her stage name that we all know her by now, Sister Rosetta Tharpe. At the age of 23, Rosetta started recording gospel songs for Decca Records. In fact, she recorded her first 4 gospel songs while being backed up by an orchestra. Those 4 songs, The Lonesome Road, My Man and I, Rock Me, and That's All, became big hits and turned Rosetta into a sensation. The song Rock Me became a very influential song on future rock and roll artists like Elvis Presley and Little Richard. Her song Down by the Riverside was selected for preservation at the National Recording Registry of the U.S. Library of Congress. Some of her songs actually ended up creating some controversy for her. See, at the time, it was tough being a female guitarist, as they were pretty rare at that point. It was even rarer when the female guitarist was black. What Rosetta did with her music, and one of the main reasons why she was finally inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, was that she started combining gospel and secular music, and also started playing with secular artists in places like the Cotton Club in New York City. That did not sit well at all with the gospel crowd, who started leaving her. She actually wanted to go back to mainly gospel music in 1943, but she was obligated by her contract to play more secular recordings. Rosetta teamed up with Marie Knight and recorded a bunch of duets and went on tour with Marie. By the end of the 1940s, though, the partnership started to break up due to other artists like Mahalia Jackson gaining more popularity. Rosetta still kept touring and recording, even touring over in Europe, until her death from a stroke on October 9, 1973. Rosetta's influence on rock and roll is immeasurable. She influenced pretty much all of the early rock and roll artists, especially during a concert in Manchester, England on May 7, 1964, that was said to influence attendees Eric Clapton, Keith Richards, and Jeff Beck. Her use of heavy distortion in her guitar kick-started electric blues. Also, she set the bar for female guitarists with the tenacity and determination that she inherited from her mother. And you can find photos and recordings of Sister Rosetta Tharpe at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. And that is it for this episode of the Music Halls of Fame podcast. For more podcast episodes, which drop every Thursday in audio and video form, then please like, subscribe, and click the notification bell on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio Podcasts, CastBox, Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcast from.